everyone to Finding Opportunity in Crisis. The webinar today is hosted by the EDHEC Chair for Foresight, Innovation and Transformation. It has been created to help firms drive desirable futures, both for themselves and society at large. As one of the top 15 business schools in Europe, academic excellence and innovative teaching extends to EDHEC Online. EDHEC Online is part of the Future of Management Education Alliance, whose aim is to revolutionize online education. Through Online, we will be launching later this year a certificate program on strategic foresight. You can follow this as a virtual program in summer 2020 and as an in-person program when our campus is open. You can learn more on online.edhec.edu. We will also be hosting Innovation Acceleration Week. For French speakers, it is an opportunity to join us for an intense series of activities on design thinking, the lean startup method, and managing innovation from the 28th of September to the 2nd of October. This webinar is being recorded, and as we have over 100 participants joining us today, all your lines are on mute. However, throughout the webinar, you can submit questions to us via the chat button that you will see at the top or the bottom of your screen. We will answer questions in the second half of this webinar, and we will also have a couple of polls throughout the session. When they pop up on the screen, select your answer and click the submit button. You may also wish to turn off the video function on your Zoom window to minimize any further disturbance to the sound quality throughout the webinar. Now let me introduce you to René Robeck, the Director of the Chair for Foresight, Innovation and Transformation and Professor of Strategy at the EDHEC Business School. In his research, René has been looking at the question of how organizations can adapt and specifically how they can transform themselves and their industries. To this end, he's developed a maturity model that helps organizations to assess the capabilities they need to continuously transform, which he calls the future fitness model. René also has a background from industry, having worked in telecoms and automobile industries. He's the founder of the Berlin-based consultancy Robeck Higa, which specializes in strategic foresight and innovation. René, you're having conversations every day with companies who are anxious about how they will be affected by this crisis and what they should do. How do organizations feel about their short and midterm future?
Yeah, thanks Camelia. Well, I think it's interesting to see that we have already so many actually joining us today. I'm just amazed seeing here on the right-hand side that we're close to 200 participants. So it seems that we all do care about what is this crisis all about and how do we get out of it. I think many organizations we talk to these days, they've gone through the same phases as we have probably come through, right? I mean, we have probably in a phase one understood, well, there is a health crisis. It's in Asia. Maybe it's never going to come here to Europe where we are right now. Then in the phase two, realizing, no, it's in Europe now. Still thinking maybe, okay, it's a health crisis. So we better get our health systems in order, but it's maybe not something which will affect me as a business. To then come to a phase three where we're saying, oh no, there's all kinds of restrictions, my business is being affected, what do I do, how deep is the affection of my business, or to which extent am I going to be affected by other businesses closing down? To then probably coming to a phase four where many of the organizations now are wondering, well, to which extent will my entire industry change? To which extent will the way I've been operating in my business environment need to change in order to survive? And I think the mission of us as a chair, but also of us here in this webinar, I think, is to move to phase five and say, you know, things will change, and that means there's also plenty of opportunities which we have presented and have ahead of us if we are able to grab them.
Thank you, Renee. So now we would like to hear from you. So coming up on your screen should be a question with 4 options. The question we'd like you to reflect on is, what is the level of threat that your organization is exposed to today?
Okay, and we can see already the results coming in. For everyone else, it's still a suspense, I guess.
It is, yes.
Some 80% have now participated in our poll.
Okay. So here we see that actually there's a significant proportion that are engaging in multiple change or major change in multiple areas. But there is actually also now a mix between those who are making minor changes, but those who are perceiving quite a high level of threat in terms of expressing a feeling that this is potentially life-threatening if we don't adapt. So there's actually quite a mix in the responses here today. So Renee, given this, how can organizations respond?
Well, when I talk to firms, the first thing I notice is that there's also a lot of entrepreneurial spirit still alive. I think this is wonderful to see. There's many firms who say, okay, well, things are changing. My business needs to keep running. I do things simply differently. That's wonderful to see. I think there's 2 major groups which I'm seeing, if you want. There's one type of response, which I call the bear response, which is, you know, my business is not as good as usual. I need to go into a type of hibernation. I want to survive through winter time, so I need to save my resources and stop much of my operations potentially. I'm seeing also what I call the and strategy, so a different set of companies who say, well, I need to continue exploring. And why I call this the ant strategy is because ants are quite remarkable animals, and an ant colony will always have a part of its population going after known sources of food, while another part of their colony is going basically outside, wandering around seemingly randomly to find new sources of food. And there's many entrepreneurs out there who say, yeah, that is probably something I need to adopt in order to be more resilient and find new opportunities. And I think there's sort of one theoretical third stance you could have, and I don't even want to mention this really as an option, but there's also what one could call the red strategy. And this is saying, well, I've got a business, I still have some liquidity, I have some cash, I'm going to take this and run and close down my business. Now, I haven't talked to anyone who is adopting this red strategy, but this is of course a big threat for the economy. And I think one thing I'd like to add also is there's a few of the bears and the ants I'm talking to, which deliberately already now start to say, I'm still maybe in the crisis, but I want to move ahead of the curve. I want to work counter-cyclical. I want to invest now when everyone else is potentially divesting, which offers good opportunities to find fantastic new recruits, which otherwise might not be available to me, find real estate for expanding your business afterwards, etc.
So which response actually makes more sense given the situation we find ourselves in today?
Well, I think one needs, for every organization and every industry, one needs to answer this question for oneself. What one needs, however, to consider is if you're on what we could call a bear strategy, then you make 2 critical assumptions. The first assumption is that you can survive over this winter time with the resources which you have available. or which might be given to you by the state. The second critical assumption is that when you come out of hibernation, out of the winter time, when spring is coming back up and the economy is picking back up, and my industry is still the industry which I knew or where my capabilities can be applied to be successful. And right now it's the time for many businesses to assess exactly that, to wonder what will my industry look like when we're coming out of the major part of this economic crisis. So I think this is also the moment where we wonder if we should not ask people again in a little poll about how do they reflect how their organization is behaving right now or what their organization is capable of doing. So what you will see coming up now is a poll which asks you first whether you're more in an organization which is more behaving like a bear, so shutting down much of its operation, trying to hibernate, trying to survive by reducing much of their activity. Or if you are more like an ant, already exploring new possibilities. And then the second part of the question is really, am I getting ready to then start my activities again in line with everyone else? Or am I getting ready to move ahead of the curve and be the first one to invest? So this is probably the poll which I've been looking forward to most, to see what kind of audience we have here in our quite large community by now. So we're seeing results in a minute of some 200 companies by now, which joined us here today in the webinar. It's an interesting race, which Camelia and I can see, which I guess you're not seeing yet, only until I'm sharing the results. You can see I have some 60% of companies who have already voted. Interestingly, the ants are doing quite well, while I have to say here in France, I'm talking more with bears who reduce much of their activities right now. So some more votes are coming in, but I'm going to share the results of the poll now. So what we see is the most populous part of these four strategies is the and cyclical. So which means that you're already in the process of exploring new opportunities and that you're getting ready to move in line with the cycle. So when the economy picks up, you will be ready to do business again. There's also quite, with 29%, quite a big audience here with the and counter-cyclical, so that they're even getting ready to move ahead of the curve. As a researcher, we would probably call this also a selection bias, because you choose to be here in this webinar, you're probably among the most progressive parts of the economy and already thinking what is the opportunities which are there. So that's, I think, a great news for us as a community here in this call. And we need to make sure that if we want a nice economic recovery, that a lot of bears are also joining the ants and exploring new opportunities.
Interesting. So we do have indeed quite. It seems that there is more of the weighting towards ants versus bears. But it seems that no matter what, we do need to consider the level of uncertainty that we're facing, and that also is not just the uncertainty, but the level of ambiguity that confronts us in terms of how indeed might outcomes play out in future. So what do organizations actually consider first in terms of making sense of the uncertainty that surrounds them today?
Yeah, so we have also shared a little do-it-yourself kit on how we help firms to work with uncertainty and find opportunity. I'd like to just give you a little peek on this. I'm going to share some slides which should be coming up now. Are we good to go with the slides?
Yes.
Good. So I think the first thing which you need to abandon is this idea that now is the moment to make predictions. It's actually not. It's now the moment to map uncertainty, because nobody can seriously in this moment say what is going to happen in the next month, 2 months, 3 months. So the first thing you should do is to start looking for the key uncertainties in your industry and for you as an organization. What's a good starting point is to say, well, I'm going to look at the political, economic, social factors, which many know as a pest analysis, to identify factors which then help me to understand what is really driving the uncertainty, with the goal of actually creating scenarios. Now, there's no rule whether you need 4 scenarios, 5 scenarios. What you're trying to achieve here is that you have a common ground to discuss inside your organization and externally with your stakeholders. To illustrate a little bit what we're talking about here, I'm added here also a slide on a little conversation I had some time ago with a restaurant owner, who at that time said, well, you know, the major uncertainties which are surrounding me now is confinement. So how long will this confinement last, and how intense is it going to be, in order to work out what kind of business I can run. My restaurant business is deeply sort of unrooted now. I can't operate it how I used to operate that, but maybe there's another business which I can work with. So once you have then different scenarios, you can start these strategizing discussions about what kind of opportunities are on the table. And in order to do that, you would then start to map also your strategic options. So what is the decisions which are either imminent or which I need to eventually take in order to build a new business? And the little technique which we're proposing here is to say, for every type of decision, I'm going to look at all the possible alternatives. And why you need to do this is because you're typically thinking about the strategy you're already implementing and not thinking broad enough in what are opportunities out there. So for our little restaurant owner here, he would say, well, you know, my default option was to stay open, to have all my employees still employed, and to do marketing by word of mouth, and to have customers who dine in, who come to my restaurant. But there's, however, still the same customers out there with the same need, only they can't come. So what is then really the opportunities which are on the table here? And I just recently read an article about a restaurant which adopted a logic of a car cinema, basically. So what they're saying is, well, there's probably still my customers out there who want some quality time with their partner or with their family. They want to cook, don't want to cook themselves, and I can't go near them. So why don't they come to the parking lot in front of my restaurant, and I'm going to wheel the food over, and then they can grab it, and I'm not near them, they're not near me, and they can still enjoy peaceful times, maybe then on the backseat of their car. So the trick is here to think outside the box sufficiently, and this little technique helps you. And
so Renee, and you know, I think as I hear you talking about options, I think there's probably another field here that could be considered in terms of partners. Because, you know, what I, for example, see for some of the small businesses here in the UK is that they are even partnering with their suppliers to create, for example, veg boxes or meat deliveries, because they can't necessarily sell it in prepared form. So you know, this is obviously a very simple schematic, but what is your perception, or what are your thoughts on evolving, you know, new aspects of your business model through partnerships?
yes, I mean, I think there's two key logics which you quite rightly address here. I mean, the first one is that obviously here this is a very small case, so you can continue adding additional strategic action lines and additional options. And what is, I think, the other interesting point you're raising is, in an economy where we have a high level of uncertainty, we cannot just optimize ourselves. We need to always think in value networks. The car industry is experiencing this now in a very hard way. They have been in very strong cost competitions for many years, and they have optimized their supply networks in order to maximize then also the cost efficiency, with then jeopardizing a lot of the resilience. So there's just a few parts which are enough to halt an entire production line, and you might not have, for instance, another option for nearshoring. I think now is also the moment where we need to loosen up a little bit our procurement strategies, our procurement guidelines, to make sure that our business can run despite the fact that we have been fighting hard for getting exactly that price from a supplier. But if that supplier is operating at a different cost level, then we need to make sure that we are also giving a higher price in order to keep the entire network for the value creation working.
And you alluded to the automobile industry, but what other advice would you have for those operating in capital intensive industries where they typically make a lot of significant upfront investment, or hotel industries, for example, where there's also high levels of fixed cost?
Yeah, the logic of building strategies under uncertainty is working quite differently actually from the traditional way of doing strategy. So to just go one step further in this little story, what this little exercise has given you now is to create a understanding of what different strategies are on the table. So what you see here is that basically out of the grid we saw before, I just started coloring the different items. And you can realize that, well, my red strategy is right now not really possible, which was staying open with my restaurant. The blue strategy would be a kind of delivery strategy. And the yellow strategy would a kind of be this bear strategy of hibernating for some time, keeping some of my employees, making sure that they're still available when I can reopen. And then you can have a first intensive internal discussion around very concrete scenarios and very concrete strategies. And this is something which in many organizations creates a lot of energy, because many organizations will have employees who are also wondering what will be the future, what is my top management thinking, how are we going to deal with the crisis, how are we going to deal with the phase after the crisis. So this gives you actually some tools to then engage in an internal discussion and potentially expand this also to external stakeholders. And I think the question you're asking, Camelia, here on behalf of the audience is, well, if I cannot choose one of those strategies because I simply don't know yet, how can I move forward? And there's a different logic here. When you do strategy under uncertainty, you need to abandon this idea that you go into retreat for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and you come out and you announce a new strategy which will last you 3 years, and you move to implementation phase. Under uncertainty, you want to work much more with options. And in fact, there's 3 types of strategic actions which you can consider. The first one would be a no regret move. So for instance, if I'm a restaurant owner, a no regret move would be that I'm doing it either myself or I'm asking my children to set up a decent website and maybe even an order online shop. Right? This is something which will do me good in any case. And it's probably not a high investment. What could be such an option, which would be the second type of strategic action, is that I'm investing heavily in my own delivery network, or I'm investing into a new business line. Let's say I realize that people also don't want to leave their home in order to get to my parking lot, but they might actually want to get half-cooked meals delivered to home, which they can finish at home. They still don't need to come up with the recipes and so on, but they still have a very similar experience with their loved ones, which they would otherwise have in my restaurant. And thirdly would be sort of big bets when you say I'm going to abandon my restaurant business altogether and I'm going to invest heavily into home delivered meals, building a subscription model and so on. That would take a lot of investment and might deplete all my resources, but it might also in this moment be just the winning business which has fantastic growth opportunities.
Great. So I noticed that we had a significant additional number of people who joined a bit later on in the webinar. So if you joined a bit later on, do send us questions using the chat button at the bottom of the Zoom window. We will come to them shortly. So Renee, we've spoken about, making sense of uncertainty through building an awareness of how the environment might change, right, using scenarios. Then we discussed, ways that, so then we moved to, so within that context, what is feasible for me as an organization through looking at your strategy playbook, so thinking about the options that might be open to me. And then we came up with a set of different strategies that we might play with over time. And you just shared with us how, some ideas or a framework for exploring what to do next. What if you're not able to choose a strategy today, particularly, or if you decide to move across those, how do you prevent the likelihood or minimize the likelihood that you're stuck, that you become paralyzed and don't move quickly to action?
Well, I think the first difficulty is that you need to abandon this idea that you can work out everything now. This is the default, which most organizations have been working with in stable environments, because in stable environments, I can benchmark against my competitors, I can look for best practices in the industry, I can mimic those best practices. While if the uncertainty around you is high enough, then this is taken away from you, or it's making very little sense, because there's no point of benchmarking against firms who also don't know the path ahead. So in the old regime, you were quite rightly optimizing efficiency, cost efficiency, also the efficiency of your operations, etc. While now you still need to focus on efficiency to be competitive, but you need to bring resilience in, and we need to relearn to ask what if questions. So what if I'm saving 1% on my cost side, but I'm exposing myself to the risk of a completely severed supply network or a halted production line? So these questions need to come in, and then the scenarios and the alternative strategies really help you navigate quickly in an agile way in this strategy space. And this is for top management teams something you change mentally, also how you discuss strategy. But then these different options really help, because when you think about it, these no regret moves, you can directly implement, you can directly invest. The options you really need to discuss. Should I invest into building a more digital part of my business? Can I make my business more virtual? And if yes, should we invest into this? And the big bets is something which you really need to discuss, not just with your top management team, but also with your owners, with other stakeholders, because that would really change the way how you operate your business. It is now also about the moment where we would move to questions from you guys. So a question about the AND strategy here. When do we know when to invest? And how do we know and predict sort of when to invest and how to then go into new spaces? Well, the clear answer here is, right now, nobody really knows. So everyone is trying to move from one step to the next, basically open up new shops. We're hearing from our governments new announcements. Sometimes they get changed afterwards. So for the next couple of months, we're going to navigate uncertainty. Now, what's important here is that this is not holding us back from economic activity. So I'm also not the oracle who is going to tell you in 1 week time is the moment to now invest into the new business. But you can still work with these no regret moves, building options now in order to capture then markets which are then presenting themselves. What is important also to remember now is that when the economy is in crisis and some traditional businesses are being disrupted, it doesn't mean that the economy is gone away. There's still businesses out there which want to buy things, which want to sell things. There's consumers there who want to buy things. And it is now the moment to go nearer to your customers and go into dialogue to understand what it is they need, what it is you can supply them with. And you might need to alter the way you work quite dramatically. But now is also the moment where completely new markets will be opening, completely new businesses will emerge, which we haven't heard before. Do you want to pick a particular one, or should I pick the next one, Camille?
You can pick the next one, Renee.
Good. So here I have one. The situation is an unprecedented challenge for humanity. There's a huge demand for healthcare equipment. As part of an and strategy, would it be relevant for industrials to shift to healthcare equipment manufacturing? And yeah, is it a bit similar like car manufacturers shifting to military equipment? I think what we are seeing right now is that our economy is still in need of a lot of medical equipment in order to be ready to reopen. So here in Europe, for instance, the European Commission is now working on guidelines for governments to take people out of confinement, and they need to meet then certain criteria. And among those criteria are, for instance, to have sufficient medical equipment, sufficient capacity in the hospitals, etc. So there's certainly a market for the next couple of months to just get this production up. And then going forward, we do also expect other waves of this virus to come and circle around the world. And we should not forget about all the countries in Africa and elsewhere where governments have much less funding than here in Europe, and they will also need equipment. And I think it's really now the moment to show solidarity in all directions. Did you have one which you like, Camelia?
Yes, there is one here. There's a theme that's coming through around questions relating to, how, obviously, the situation is changing very quickly. And we do need to continuously revise and update the alternatives that we might be pursuing over time. So how can we also, to help us do that, how do we predict or measure the change in needs?
Yeah, I think many organizations had sensors directed at their market, which were well built up. So, you go into benchmarking, you look at what's going on in your industry, who is getting more sales, less sales, etc. In uncertain environment, you need to expand this sensor platform which you have dramatically. So for many organizations, it's now the question which they need to ask themselves, what's the blind spots? Where else can I look to detect early signals of change? What we typically emphasize is to really take this notion of building for yourself a radar through which you can discuss in your organization what are the change drivers, and then to even set certain alert thresholds. And you say, if, for instance, the export is picking back up over a certain threshold, then that seems to be that there's people who have found ways to export again to these countries, and I could try to find out how they do it and follow suit. So there's a lot about opening this horizon. You can use this scanning, which we discussed as a framework, but it's also about asking you, where in my organization do I have outward facing people who can bring in this information about early signals of change. I've got a nice one here. It could be from one of our students talking about education. How good a time is it now for studying finance in Europe or business analytics? Well, I think it's a very good time to study in general, because we will need a lot of skilled people to also rebuild interesting businesses in general. I think what we will see more is that there's a bit of a shift and focus in education, and we're experiencing this also ourselves in our business school, back from analytics based just on numbers to analytics based also on models, to model also different scenarios and how they would play out. Also generally to emphasize more strategic frameworks which allow you to think outside the box rather than just confirming what you expect to be the case. And I think we're also in an interesting moment now to test new ways of educating. I mean, we're all moved to some distance learning, both for our business school, but many of us also for their own children. And we see many hiccups. At our business school, we are very lucky that we have had already an initiative started with EDHEC Online some time ago to offer full degree programs online. So we're well equipped in this asynchronous type of learning. We'll see much more of this. And we as a business school, we're also getting ready to welcome students who say, well, we won't be there the first 2 months, even if your campuses are open, but we will physically not be there, but we want to enroll, we want to follow your programs, and we will be ready for these students as well.
So there's a question on what's the ideal time horizon to build your strategy and to build scenarios for businesses. Of course, it will depend on the type of business, but Renee, can you shed some more light on ideal time horizons?
Yes, I think here we, in a crisis mode, you typically have a short-term horizon and a mid-term horizon, which could be a sort of 2-3 months horizon, and a horizon which goes, depending on your industry, to 2, 3, or 4 years. And I would recommend to run both in parallel. In both, you assess the same type of questions. So what are the drivers of change? What does that mean then for the options which lay on the table? Because you do need to build now in parallel what I would call an operational crisis management. So you want to know what is happening if my supply chain is disrupted. How do I then find a new supplier, etc. While you also need to tackle what I would call the structural crisis management, where you say, well, if my industry gets further disrupted and we have a prolonged period of confinement, for instance, what could be then the outcomes of the futures in my industry? And at the same time, we should always remember that this strategizing under uncertainty builds then on these no regret moves, on building options, on placing big bets, which allows you to take decisions even without having a prediction, without having a confirmed opinion about what the market will look like, which we are targeting.
And I guess building on that, in crisis, indeed, the temptation is potentially to chase whatever is in front of us. Of course, earlier you spoke about the bear strategy, which is more about, the hibernation, preserving your resources. But there's also the flip side of that, which could be around, indeed, just being highly opportunistic. What's the balance here between, being opportunistic about what's in front of you, but being kind of, but being strategically agile?
Yeah, I think we emphasize, and that also some of you might have spotted this on this last little template which I was showing, there was also what we call a consistent strategic ambition. We often feel that for an organization, it's quite useful to engage in an internal dialogue around what is this ambition. Some use the term massive transformational purpose as a term to flag that we as an organization, we need to stand for something. So even if we change tactics, if we move, we do need to make sure that everyone in our organization and our stakeholders know what we stand for. So this is typically this anchor which you need to build for yourself in order to then have also a chance to really bring a lot of energy behind new strategic actions and around this direction you're heading.
So, and a question here, if you had to choose between developing strategies for multiple scenarios, so building robustness, to make versus making your business more agile, which would be more efficient in these uncertain times?
Yeah, I mean, here we, of course, have the joy of real entrepreneurial decisions, because it will be in the end up to you and your investors what to choose. There's some businesses which by default will need to be more risk averse, while others can have more of this maverick sense of saying, well, I'm going to go after this opportunity, and this is the opportunity which will only be present in one scenario, and if this scenario is not coming, then I start a new business, but this one is gone. So this will still be something you need to answer for yourself together with your investors. But right now, the importance is that if you're going after sort of ensuring that your car business, for instance, is stabilizing, you need to make sure that you build more resilience into the system. And for that, you should not stop by building scenarios and use them in the top management team. Scenarios and scenario thinking is really something which you need to bring into the entire organization, because you can also expose your employees to uncertainty. You can tell them, we also, as the top management team, we don't know, but there's these options on the table, and you better also in the supply chain, in the IT department, in the HR department, you better get ready for different futures.
So would you agree that scenario thinking actually helps in developing agility?
Absolutely. So what we see very frequently in organizations who start to enter uncertain environments, and you don't need a fundamental crisis for that. Many entrepreneurs, many businesses, they have entered very uncertain environments before. But when you do that for the first time, you're suddenly realizing, well, the tools which are used until here, they seem not to work as they are supposed to work. And you're quite right about that. When you're entering into an uncertain environment, you need to build for yourself these new anchors. And these two anchors are really these alternative strategies and these alternative scenarios. And then you're often in for quite an exciting discovery that you realize I can actually navigate my business like that without having certainty, because that might even open up for me the opportunity, as many multinational organizations realize that, to say, you know, in this market, it looks like this scenario, so I'm going to apply this strategy there. While in this market, I'm more in another scenario and I'm going to apply that strategy there. So that you let uncertainty come into your thinking and your working in your organization. You create this agility of taking fast decisions, of saying, yeah, okay, well then apply this strategy, please. And this is how we defined it, even if in our home market or where the corporate headquarters are, we are applying a different strategy.
And final question from the audience here is, you know, how would the approach differ between applying it to governments versus business?
It's a good question. I'm exposed to this question from time to time, where I typically say, first, well, I'm really a guy working with businesses, but I'm increasingly also working with governments or non-governmental organizations. And the techniques, they are very similar, because you basically need to have the same anchors. You want to have scenarios in mind. As governments and as organizations, we also are in an ecosystem together. And the thing we should also not remember or not forget here in crisis situations is that many crises allow us also to re-emerge in something much nicer than we were before. If we think even about such devastating crises like the Second World War, it was also a time that after we came out of it, we had much more equality in income, much more equality in terms of gender. So good things can come out of crisis. And this is, I think, the responsibility of all of us, whether we are business schools, whether we are businesses, whether we are governments, to make sure that we come out stronger out of this crisis, rather than getting ready to point fingers, for instance.
And do you think that this is going to prompt a fundamental shift in the way that we live, work, travel, or will it simply be a matter of time before we go back to our old ways?
Yeah, as a futurist, as a foresighter, we typically expect that we have strong resilience in systems. So systems have a tendency to reproduce themselves, to stabilize themselves, and it's not easy to bring a system out of one state into another state, because there's these systemic effects inside at work. Now, if there's enough trigger points, however, then systems do change. And the longer this crisis lasts, the longer we will have societies in confinement, the more likely it gets that we are also questioning the things which have been dear to us before. So it is very important now that every organization and every individual, for that matter, is taking some time to reflect, well, what is the thing which is important for me? What is maybe my massive transformational purpose? But also, you know, what is the thing which I want to push for? Because the beautiful thing about the future is that it's not made yet. It's for all of us to shape.
Great, thank you, Renee. So as we come to the end of our time today, to summarize the key points from our session, we spoke a lot about responding to and shaping the future environment, which requires us to recognize and exploit opportunities. So back to the bear and the and strategies that we spoke about at the top of the webinar. Also, to develop this ability to sense, interpret, and act on critical information, scenarios and scenario thinking can help to bring structure to what is otherwise unstructured and to broaden our sense of what is indeed possible. We then need to go inside and look at the capabilities of the organization to sustain us as those contexts evolve. So building a clear strategy to drive desirable futures then means mapping choices that help us make sense of what is indeed feasible and indeed desirable for us. And then finally, deciding what to do next is going to be a combination of no regret moves, options, and big bets that helps to ensure that we're moving forward at pace but consistently, but while also making sense of new information, thereby helping us to build strategic agility. So in the next 3 to 4 days, we will send you an email so that we can continue our dialogue on this topic and support you in various ways. So that email will contain further information on our online certificate course via EDHEC Online on strategic foresight to be launched in summer 2020. You'll also be able to access a free white paper which outlines the research by Renee and his team on how organizations transform. You have access to our DIY toolkit, which we provided an overview of here today. And there will also be details on another upcoming webinar focused on the first learnings from managing the COVID-19 crisis from Hong Kong, Italy, and Singapore. And Renee, one last thing before we close. I understand that there's an initiative look where students are actually in a position to help apply some of these tools to firms. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, gladly do so. This is really something which currently is really warming my heart. My students had also a really hard time to move into confinement and seeing us only online, or sometimes the connection closes down. But many of them have said, well, we would like still to help companies around here in France, but also elsewhere. So we're right now putting together an initiative which we call EDHEC Students Against the Crisis. And we'll be also sending some more information about that in the follow-up email, how you also as an organization can reach out to us and say, well, I would like to be one of those companies which get help from student volunteers to apply this type of scenario thinking, which we have discussed here today. So I'm really excited about that and want to thank all the students who have come forward and say, well, I would like to help out. It's also wonderful to see. I also just posted yesterday an email to some of the companies which I know could help us with some tools, and there's already 3 companies which have come back and said, well, we are ready to help. There's Itonics, which will give the students a platform for working with trends and working with roadmaps. There is Trend One, which is going to give us free access to their trend database. And there's also the Parmenides Foundation with their IDOS tool to do scenario thinking, which all have said, you know, if the students want to help firms, they're going to get free access, free licenses. So thanks very much also to them.
Great. So we look forward to engaging with you, and thank you again so much for your time and for your questions and comments through this webinar.
Thanks very much. I see also my Danish friends here who have already the luck to bring some of their children back to school. Thanks for joining.